Steve, for our listeners, can you give us a little bit of an overview of Solent Strategies? Who do you help? How do you help them?
Sure. So Solent Strategies, we're a marketing consultancy. I founded about a year ago, and we work with tech startups, small businesses who are looking to punch above their weight effectively. So we help them develop their voice, find a bigger audience. A lot of cases, it's actually building their own in-house marketing teams through mentoring or just helping them, identify the right people. My whole career, I started out as an engineer, but I've always worked for tech companies. And the stuff that I always enjoyed doing is effectively coming in early in that growth phase and building a marketing function and building a marketing team. I did that for a number of companies as an employee. And then I figured, well, let me start Solent Strategies and see if I can help a bunch of companies do that at the same time.
With Solent Strategies, you decided to launch a podcast, The Marketing Mix. Can you give our listeners an overview of that podcast and what they can expect when they subscribe?
Yeah, so The Marketing Mix, it was an idea I'd had probably for a couple of years. And it largely came out of my desire to just have interesting conversations with other marketers, people that maybe I wouldn't get to talk to normally, or maybe folks I know, but I just don't talk to them often enough or don't get into a level of detail. So it really started out almost as a passion project of, I just want to talk about marketing, particularly during the pandemic when we couldn't get out to networking events and marketing meetings. So what it's evolved into is I talk to B2B marketing practitioners, people who are out there working in SEO or content marketing or whatever is their area of expertise. And in those episodes, we dig into a specific topic, right? So one of the most downloaded ones I took with Nikki Fabrizio, who's a content marketer, and she talked specifically about case studies. How do you find the right people for case studies? How do you develop them? So the idea being somebody who's running a small business, maybe doesn't have a full-time marketing team, but they know they want to do case studies. They can listen to this podcast and get some clues along the way. And then the other part of it is interviewing founders or leaders of small companies about how they do marketing or how they've built marketing in their company. Overall, the idea is to help founders, small business folks who they know they want to do more with marketing. They don't really know where to start. So this is a way for them to dig in and learn some more.
Okay. So you've got some of the tactical perspective, but then also some of the strategic perspective from the founders who are growing the business and view marketing from a different lens.
Yeah, because I think it's tough, right? When you talk to, it's very easy for us to get in that echo chamber of talking to marketers, and we're talking about the latest thing, whether it's what are you doing with TikTok, or how do you think AI is going to impact SEO, and we can talk about that stuff for ages. The reality is, in small businesses and for founders, that's only one thing that they're thinking about, right? They're also thinking about recruitment and payroll and production or development, whatever it may be, right? So marketing is one sliver of it. So yeah, really what I'm getting at is for that 10% of their time when they're thinking about marketing, or maybe it's on the drive home from work when somebody has said to them, man, we really need to do something about our SEO strategy. Let's give them a 30-minute podcast where they can get some ideas and sort of get those juices flowing.
Yeah. And so how have you used the podcast content that you produce in your own business? So I know you have the podcast as a channel, but are you using that in any other different kind of way?
So there's a couple of ways. I mean, one of the obvious ones is I post snippets of it on LinkedIn, right? Because that typically is where my clients and my prospects are. They're looking on LinkedIn. So I'll take a video snippet out of it and publish some findings on there. The other way I found it useful is if I'm talking to either a client or maybe a prospect about a particular subject, and let's say, boy, Steve, I'm really wondering, I've been doing Google ads, they're not paying off. I think maybe I need to stop it. And I can say, well, hey, I did this podcast with Katie Kingsbury about what makes a great Google Ads campaign. Hey, let me send you a link to it, right? So it's either supportive to existing clients, or it could be a way to build some credibility or show the value of Solent Strategies to a potential client.
Yeah, that's what I found too, is what's one of the biggest benefits of a podcast is you can use those conversations to enable other sales conversations, right? So you
Yeah,
talking with an expert, you're bringing their expertise in and helping your own customers or your own prospects kind of connect the dots.
right. So it's a credibility play for the business. It's an educational benefit or educational tool for the clients. And then the other way that and this isn't how I use the marketing mix, but let me zig a little bit. So the first podcast I did was about 4 years ago. At the time, I was running marketing at a company called Open Gear, and we were selling IT solutions to big enterprise companies. And we had a strategic sales team. They had a list of accounts they were going to go after, but some of those they had trouble getting into. So I started a podcast where I was interviewing CTOs, CIOs, top-level IT folks about, we were pushing this idea of something called network resilience, right? So I would say, hey, I have this podcast on network resilience. Would love to interview you about how your company, deals with this, pays attention to it. And it was purely, we obviously never admitted at the time, but it was purely about prospecting. Because if I could get an interview with somebody at, let's say, PayPal, you immediately get some credibility within that organization because people now are aware of your company. But anybody who works for that person, that CIO or whoever it may be, is probably going to listen to that because they want to know what their boss is thinking about. That person then shares it with their network. So suddenly we go from nobody at that company knowing who we are to having all these different sort of awareness points. And then for the sales team, they were able to go to the people they were trying to reach to at that company and say, hey, we've just done this podcast, thought you might be interested in it. So it sort of fitted on multiple levels. So that was how I really got interested and really found that I enjoyed doing podcasts. And that was purely about prospecting and business development.
That's a great use case for a podcast. And it's very interesting to see how that fits into an overall account-based marketing strategy.
And I think that's exactly it. You're right. It's part of an ABM strategy. You have to have some of those strategic tools in place. You have to have salespeople who know how to go after strategic accounts, right? It has to. It's one tool in that ABM toolkit. It's also a little cynical. So I often don't talk to people about it because it comes across as, well, that's a bit sneaky, isn't it? But the reality is, why is somebody agreeing to be a guest on that podcast? It works for them, right? Either they're trying to build their reputation, get the word out. So to me, it's still an equal transfer of value. It's a little different to what we think of as the usual podcast approach.
Sure. Well, a podcast is a great way to work on your personal brand, right? You're getting reps at speaking, so you're improving your speaking skill. You're getting reps at networking, and you get your face on social media and these guests, and it feels good, right? There's endorphins that kick in when you see those likes and comments on social media. Yeah, you get a little dopamine rush. But
absolutely.
So there's a mutual exchange of value, and building the personal brands of the people within a company is good for the overall brand too. So let's just use PayPal as an example. A company, their brand is strengthened by the people that go out and do those podcasts.
Yeah, I think that's very true. So one thing I came up against with the larger organizations, and in that podcast, we were only going for the larger organizations. Sometimes they get caught up in the whole approvals process.
Yeah, yeah.
But what I found really interesting, whenever I've done case studies, those are a nightmare, right? Any marketer who's tried to get a case study signed off by a Fortune 500 company or even a mid-sized company, it's a nightmare because everybody wants to look at it. The legal team has to sign off on it. Half the time, it just gets blocked completely.
Yeah.
Somehow, I think it just hasn't caught up yet. I have not seen that level of approval required for a podcast. Typically, people say, oh, I should ask my next level of management. And they say, sure, it's a podcast. It's fine. I've never had legal get involved in that level of it. So it may be a softer way of starting to interact with a company and getting almost that reflective credibility, right? Of having a big brand name get involved in one of your marketing activities.
Well, Steve, let's shift gears a little bit away from podcasts and let's talk about your newsletter. So I guess kind of like the chicken and the egg scenario. Let me ask you, which came first, the newsletter or the podcast?
Yeah, this one's very clear, actually. So this was the podcast. The podcast came first. And again, partly because that was the one I was more interested in doing and I knew it would be fun. So I'd been doing that for, I'm guessing, maybe 3 months before I started doing the newsletter. And the newsletter was really for a different intent. And I actually hesitated. I wasn't sure whether to give it the same name as the podcast, and I'm still not sure if that was the right idea. The point of the podcast for me was I was talking to a lot of people, whether it was going to networking events, reaching out to prospects, having good initial consultation calls with people. But then how do you stay in touch with them, right? So one of the things as marketers we often talk about is the danger of social media is you don't own any of that, right? So most of us have great LinkedIn networks and connections and all that. You build that up, but what if LinkedIn changes their algorithm, right? What if you get banned from LinkedIn? So a newsletter you own, right? The email list you own. So for me, it's a very good way of just constantly putting out valuable information to a list of people that I've built up and sort of created over time. And it overlaps, right? A lot of those people I'm also connected with on LinkedIn. So that was the original idea for the newsletter. But then, of course, I have this great content from a podcast. So it'd be crazy of me not to include that in the newsletter. And I played around with a couple of things. Initially, I was doing a weekly newsletter. So one week would be just about the podcast. And then the next week would be sort of my general ramblings about marketing and anything I was interested in. The reality is that's a lot of work to be doing that. And by the way, so my podcast frequency is, so I do a podcast every 2 weeks. So what I now set up is 1 week I do a podcast, next week I do the newsletter, following week I do a podcast. So basically every week there is something new going out. And so I've combined the newsletter. So the newsletter now, typically there is something about marketing that I'm interested in that I want to talk about. So I lead off with that. Then I have a recap of the podcast, and it's normally a couple of paragraphs explaining, and then it's a video clip, maybe 2 or 3 minutes taken from the podcast, so somebody can just browse that. And then the other thing I do at the end, I have the drink of the week to time with this idea of the marketing mix, because part of the name behind the marketing mix was this idea of it's the kind of conversation I'd like to have with a marketer over a cocktail, right?
Oh, there you go.
It's one thing talking through a screen like we are here, but it's much more fun doing it at a bar over a drink or a coffee. So the last question I ask everybody on my podcast is, hey, if we're doing this in the real world, what would we be drinking? So I take the best of that, or maybe something I've had recently, and that becomes the drink of the week in the newsletter. And I hope that's an incentive for people to read, or at least scroll all the way to the bottom and get a cocktail out of it at the end. So the newsletter has 3 things. It's basically a marketing issue or something that I'm interested in, a recap of the podcast, and then this drink of the week.